Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, I have been on a mission and I'm going to tell you about it. Let's get started. For my avid listeners, you know that a couple of weeks ago I mentioned that I was going on this mission to Israel in order to experience, see, and hear everything there is to do with October 7th and the attack that happened against Israel by Hamas terrorists in the south of Israel. I do apologize in advance. It might be longer than a typical episode. Listen to this in steps and stages if you need. It also will cover a lot of very difficult topics, very sensitive topics. So please, if you have your children listening, viewer discretion is advised. And also maybe you need to take a break for emotional reasons throughout this podcast because it wasn't easy. And there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to be sharing that isn't easy to talk about. Just a reminder for anyone who maybe hasn't heard my last episodes where I discussed this mission. The idea behind it was that a bunch of educators are going to be going to Israel in order to learn about these sites, learn from the people who were there in order to come back to Canada to teach about it and to share what we learned, what we experienced, and make sure that people aren't able to spread the misinformation that typically is spread around social media and in our society as a whole. On our first day, we had a pretty interesting introduction. We tried to do it sort of in chronological order, if we want to call it that. And we figured that there were some people who might not be up to date on the current events. So therefore, we had to get an overview of the history of the Middle East, history of the region, how we got here, and also what the aftermath and what we would be seeing when we're in Israel. And for that, we spoke with the author Matti Friedman. He wrote books, he worked for newspapers, and he gave us sort of the overview of the post-October 7th society that is Israel and how people are sort of coping and dealing with the situation, what the current status is of the Israeli situation and the war. It was really, really insightful. And he said a lot of very interesting things, especially being a journalist. He used to work for the Associated Press many years ago, and he discussed with us a lot of very interesting facts that he had learned. You know, back when he started as a journalist, journalism was very different. Telling the stories, telling truth, telling facts, giving the information with as little bias as one can give. Obviously, everyone has bias. But he said as he tried to put out stories and tried to get along in this world of journalism, he's realized that journalism today has really changed. And he was describing the way that journalism, especially around the October 7th and Israel as a whole, has really been taken over by what he called activists. So rather than journalists running newspapers, they have activists who have infiltrated these centers of power and information and were able to put out stuff that they wanted to, and the, for lack of a better word, propaganda and their cause that they're choosing to focus on. And we saw that, unfortunately, this is a big problem for Israel. He pointed out the fact that the Middle East, especially Israel, has more journalists than all sub-Saharan Africa. The entire sub-Saharan Africa has less AP journalists located around than one country. And in his idea, it's because, look, that story sells. People want to hear the death and destruction in Israel and all the bad things that Israel's doing, and they put dozens of reporters in one country and don't really care about reporting about Africa because, as he puts it, really, no one cares about hearing what's going on in Africa. It's a sad truth. It's a sad reality. They go where the money is. He points out that Western audiences really need a good guy and a bad guy, right? It boils down to good storytelling. And if you have a good bad guy and a good guy, people will read it. People will watch it. And unfortunately, people have been sort of brainwashed into believing that the Israelis are the bad guy, that it's such an easy story to tell. Once you've manipulated this good guy, bad guy dynamic, it's just a matter of filling in the blanks of whatever today's incident is into that formula. And it sells. But what was very interesting that he pointed out is if you think about the media today, if you were to take a microscope and look at just the Israel area under a microscope, of course, right now, you'd see big, strong Israel and the poor Palestinian Arabs and see that the Israelis are so much bigger and so much more powerful, have so much more money and so on and so on. Of course, they look like good guy, bad guy, oppressor, oppressed, all that stuff. But what was interesting is he actually brought up the idea of if you take the magnifying glass and move back and you zoom out, what you'd actually see is that Israel is this tiny country among 20 other countries that are Arab that really don't care much for Israel. So when you zoom out of this story, you realize that Israel is the underdog, but they make sure when they report to only focus on Israel and supposedly Palestine, rather than focusing on the entire Middle East and the entire conflict, allowing people to report or broadcast on simply that zoomed in view will give them the narrative that they want, as opposed to zooming out and realizing what the larger narrative of the entire region is, which is that Israel is under constant threat and constant attack. But there were two incredibly important things that Matti Friedman talked about. It started with this discussion about a situation that he remembered when he was doing some research. Not many of you may have heard of Nachal Oz. Nachal Oz is a kibbutz, which is right on the border of Gaza. And the reason why all of these kibbutzim are on the border of Gaza is because Ben Gurion, some of the early leaders of Israel, decided that when the 1948 war was over and the borders between Israel and Egypt were solidified, they decided that we need people to move down to these borders because essentially if nobody lives there, it's just a matter of time before that land is either given to Egypt or it's taken by Egypt, and we need people to essentially be on the borders to make sure we mark our land that is ours. And so a lot of people did go down, and they created kibbutzim, which many of them were on the Gaza border during the attack. But Nachal Oz was one of them. And he told us a story from 1956 when a former defense minister, Moshe Dayan, came down to Nachal Oz, one of the kibbutzim that was currently attacked on October 7th, but was attacked in 1956, and a Jewish man was killed by people from Gaza. It's ironic that the story is very much similar. But he gave an interesting speech to the Jewish people. He told the people who were mourning the death of their friend who lived in Nachal Oz, the light of his heart blinded his eyes from the flash of the knife. Now this, Matti Friedman said, was alluding to the fact that the idea of peace and the idea of coexistence and the love in this man's heart to try to coexist with the Arabs who lived in the Gaza region, unfortunately blinded himself from seeing the knife that eventually killed him. And the idea behind this, as Matti Friedman would put it, said that unfortunately, as much as we want to be coexisting with these people, we can't allow ourselves to ignore the security risks. And Moshe Dayan even went so far to suggest that the death of this man was actually the Israelis' fault. Now, that might seem very crazy to you to think that he's blaming the Israelis for the fact that their friend was killed. But what he's suggesting is that we know the people across the way want us dead. We know the people across the way are going to try to kill us. And it is on us to blame ourselves for not protecting ourselves. We need to make sure we are safe. And it was an interesting way that Matti Friedman had decided to frame this situation. This was in 1956. With a very similar situation where somebody crossed the Gaza border, which at that point was literally just a row of hedges. There was no fences or borders, but they were killed on the border by people from Gaza, and we haven't really learned our lesson. We put up fences, we put up all of these things, but unfortunately, in the end, it was a very similar outcome. People were killed, and we need to blame ourselves as Jewish people that we can't really expect better from them, unfortunately, the way things are going, the misinformation that they're fed, the education system. We have to focus on how we can do better and protect ourselves. And that was an interesting way to frame the argument. Rather than fully blaming the people in Gaza, we need to figure out how we need to blame ourselves for not being prepared. But one more thing he added, which really colored the entire trip, and you'll hear it throughout this entire podcast. He described what is now known, it's a common term in Israel when talking about October 7th, is the battle for the door handle. He used this term frequently because apparently it happened almost everywhere. So to explain this, and it will come up many times in this podcast, the battle for the door handle essentially was happening in all of the kibbutzim and all of the homes in southern Israel on the October 7th attack. The bomb shelters that many people went into don't have locks. Nobody ever expected for anyone to lock the door because if, let's say, the building is attacked in some way with a rocket, you need to have that door able to open so the people who are coming in to rescue in a broken down house doesn't need to deal with a lock. So none of the bomb shelters that are mandatory in all Israeli homes, none of them have locks on them because nobody ever thought that people would physically come in and that would turn into a safe room for an armed attack. It was always meant for rockets. And so what happened in almost every single case, once the rockets went off on October 7th, which is how the attack started, with 30 minutes of rockets, and again, you'll hear this over and over in the podcast, everybody was going to their shelters, which is something that happens almost every day in various parts of Israel. And little did they know that at the same time, people were infiltrating and coming into their kibbutzim and their homes, and eventually they would have to physically hold that door handle with all of their strength and all of their might in order to stop the terrorists from getting in. And it was now referred to in Israel as this whole genre of telling these stories is the Battle of the Door Handle. So now that we were set up with a little bit of a background and understanding the conflict and what's been going on day 2, we headed down south. It was pointed out to us literally that the Hamas terrorists essentially seized a main road and a main junction. And so therefore, any cars that were trying to flee any of these sites were killed in their cars. And pretty much it was a death road, which we found out in many cases when we were talking to survivors and people who went to these sites to go and try and rescue others. But we finally get to Kibbutz Be'eri. Kibbutz Be'eri is one of the ones that was affected really heavily. And there are other ones. We didn't get to go to all of them, but it was the same similar story. Kibbutzim, these are little communities that are very small, tight-knit groups of people. They all live together. It's very socialist in nature, depending on the kibbutz you're in. And many of us, you may have, but I definitely have been to a kibbutz before, either in the south or the north. They are beautiful places. Often these places have guest houses, which are sort of like little hotels that they try and make extra income with. You can go and stay there for a couple nights, and they are beautiful, beautiful places. For anybody who's never been to a kibbutz or for anything I'm going to talk about, if you go to our Instagram at jdr.podcast, there are photos you could take a look at and read the descriptions. And I go through a lot of this stuff from when I was there. You'll see it. But when we get to Be'eri, we actually meet someone who lived there. And he gave us, I hate to call it a tour because it feels so weird to tour a site of mass murder, but we'll call it a tour for the time being. But he gave us a tour of essentially the entire grounds. We saw places like, for example, the dentist's office, which happened to be the place where they were bringing people who had been harmed in order to help them. The dentist, I guess, was acting as a little bit of a doctor along with a paramedic who lived on the kibbutz. And they were bringing people to this site in order to try and help them. And unfortunately, the doctor, the paramedic, and many others in that room, once the terrorists had gotten to them, murdered them all. And so we saw the remnants of what was left of the dentist's office and the photos of the people who had been killed. And as we walked past the dentist's office, we saw what was called the Gan, G-A-N, which essentially means daycare. And the daycare had bullet holes all over it. To think that these terrorists were purposefully shooting into a children's daycare just goes to show the depravity of the situation. And then we walked past this beautiful open garden that he showed us. It was kind of like a field where he says that all of the holidays were celebrated. The entire community would come out to this sort of main grassy square, and they would have their holidays and picnics and things like that. And it was really quite tranquil. If you didn't see the other things, you wouldn't have known all of the other bad stuff that had gone on. It looked pretty beautiful. And then he told us that that was the site, unfortunately, where after the attack had occurred, where all of the body bags were laid out. And kibbutz members who did survive had to come and identify bodies. And it is a real stark contrast between this beautiful spot that was meaning so much to these people. It was like a center of their community, ending up being, unfortunately, the place where they would have to come and identify their loved ones who had been killed. And then we went to probably some of the worst damage. So the more close to the Gaza border that you were, because these kibbutzim literally were feet away from the Gaza border, that's where the most damage was caused. So we got closer and you can see that the buildings, again, go check out our social media, jdr.podcast, were completely destroyed. We saw houses completely burned down. And the crazy thing is, you can still see in photos some of the children's toys that were left, like as if the kid dropped their bike there on October the 6th and it hasn't moved. It's like a ghost town. It was really kind of eerie. And what was pointed out to us by the person giving us tours is that it was interesting how the Hamas terrorists purposefully seemed to attack all of the homes with children in it, the young families. There were incidents of elder people because certain areas of the kibbutz had old people, 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds that are there as their sort of retirement. And many of them weren't touched at all. We saw them kidnap a few of the Holocaust survivors. But fortunately, some of them weren't touched at all. And this gentleman's suggestion was that because their directory is on their website, that the Hamas people seem to go door to door to the young family houses as possibly, his suggestion was, to essentially cut off the next generation. They didn't really care to kill the old people. They left some of the old people alone. They killed the babies and the young people because it was the next generation, and they wanted to make sure that they cut that line. He told us a story of one elderly man who lived next door to a burnt-up house, who literally was too old, and he said, I'm not even going to bother when the rockets go off to even get into a shelter. I lived a great life. I'm 90, don't care. And supposedly he sat there in his house, didn't go into a shelter, and survived the entire ordeal because they never really even bothered to go into his house, even though he was right next door to houses filled with younger people and children, and they burnt those houses down and killed everybody inside. But the most difficult site on Be'eri was the house of his in-laws, his wife's parents. And we went inside this house, and again, you can see pictures on our JDR podcast Instagram. The house was utterly destroyed. We literally didn't even walk in the door. We walked in through a massive gaping hole in the wall. And he tells us this story about his family. So he explained to us that his mother and father-in-law were like the linchpin of their family. Everybody would go over to their house to eat and to chat and to have Shabbat dinners and all of this amazing stuff. And it was so much that typically on a Saturday morning, their children would just get up from their beds and go to grandma and grandpa's house, and they would go and play. And they'd actually give the parents sort of a nice Saturday morning, quiet, alone. And this is kind of what kibbutz life is. You're in a very small area. It's gated off, and your kids can kind of go and run anywhere, like run down the road to your grandparents' house. No big deal. And that's what they would do every Saturday. And he said to us, because the attack happened on a Saturday morning, had it happened an hour later, his children probably would have been in that room, in that house, or even on the way to the house when Hamas showed up, and his kids would have been killed. So he and his family, like many people, were hiding in their bomb shelter because the rockets had started at 6:30 in the morning, and they didn't really think much of it. It was very common and normal, living next to the border. The rockets go off for many, many years now. You get into your shelter 10 minutes later and you're out. No big deal. You move on with your day. However, after 10 minutes, the alarms were still going off, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and he said that he noticed something was wrong. This isn't normal that 30 minutes go by with all of these sirens going off. And all of a sudden he realized that the WhatsApp chat for his kibbutz friends, they all are in a WhatsApp chat, were saying that they see Hamas terrorists coming and there's people walking around and they're trying to break into my house and things of that nature. And all of a sudden you see frantic texts, even so much that his parents or his in-laws ended up messaging them and telling them that they were also being infiltrated by Hamas terrorists. His parents were desperate to hold the door closed. They did what is now known as the battle for the door handle. His father-in-law tried to hold the door closed as long as he could, and the Hamas terrorists ended up shooting through the door and hitting his father with a bullet. He was now really hurt, and the mother tried to hold the door closed while with one arm holding her cell phone and sending a voice note to her kids saying, your father's been hurt. I'm holding the door shut. I don't think we're going to survive. I don't know what to do. And he ended up playing for us the audio clip of his mother's last words before she was killed by Hamas. And it was devastating. We can see the door of the safe room that has been shot through multiple times. We see the complete and utter destruction with kids' toys burnt and thrown around the entire building that's been completely taken apart. Thankfully, by the end, he and his family were safe. Unfortunately, his children are traumatized. He told us stories about how he tried to keep his kids calm, quiet, and active while sitting in a bomb shelter, knowing what was going on outside. He described seeing the WhatsApp chat that was once filled with texts from all his friends warning about the attack slowly go quiet, as he assumed people were being unfortunately killed. Finally, when the IDF takes them out of the house, there was still fighting going on in certain areas and there were still terrorists around. So the IDF had to pull him and his family out of his shelter and try and get him to military vehicles. But unfortunately, his children had to walk past all of the people that had been harmed, terrorists and kibbutz people. And so the IDF tells them, put your hands over the kid's face or put the kid's face into your arms and just run, essentially. Run for your life. And they tried to get them to this bus. And they survived. And amazingly, he was saying that you get on the bus and you kind of look around. And again, this is a kibbutz. So everybody knows everybody. Everybody was looking around the bus to essentially see who's died. You'd see parents without their children. You'd see mothers without their kids. You'd see husbands without their wives. And because they all know each other, you knew that, unfortunately, these people on this bus are the only survivors from your kibbutz. He later, finally, once the Hamas terrorists were removed from that region by the IDF, decided to go back and see what he can salvage from the event. He went to his in-laws' house and saw all of his old albums and things like that, and he went to take them. And what he said was he found a Hamas terrorist, unfortunately still laying on the floor after being killed there. And when he noticed near the Hamas terrorist was a couple of grenades. So he and his friend, who was helping him, decided they were going to get out of there. What happened, apparently, according to the IDF, was that those grenades eventually did go off, which is what caused all of that damage to the house, to the point where you can see it in the photos on our Instagram. Hearing this story, sharing this story even, you can't imagine what it would feel like to be in that situation, knowing your family members are so close and that you can't help them because you yourself are a target. It's probably unbearable. And to hear your family's last words recorded for posterity because they voice noted you right before they were murdered, I just can't imagine what it would feel like. One thing that really stuck out is he said essentially that the people who survived Be'eri and some of the other places around that area on October 7th essentially are like Holocaust survivors, but just don't have the number, the number on the arm that a lot of Holocaust survivors had. I think he was trying to suggest that we still have the same kind of fear, pain, trauma like the Holocaust, but unfortunately we don't get seen as Holocaust survivors. You can't see him, who looks like a normal person, and know the trauma he's carrying. Whereas with the Holocaust survivors and the numbers on the arm, you kind of know what they went through. It was really a powerful statement. After we had left Be'eri, we went to the next site, one that arguably might be more emotional than Be'eri, and that is the Nova site, the site of that music festival that was attacked so brutally. The one thing that I'll say that stuck out to me, I've been to the sites of the Holocaust, and for anyone who might have listened to my earlier podcast on that, I talked a little bit about the idea of these mass graves in Europe. We went through essentially this forest to get to these mass graves that the Nazis had made. And when we pulled up to the Nova Festival, it's in a national park, you drive through a very oddly similar situation. You drive down a road lined by trees, which looks almost identical to the forests of Tikochin, which was a place of a mass grave. And being in both places, it just struck me immediately that it looked identical. And obviously knowing what happened on the other side of those trees is all the more reason to make that comparison. But when we finally get to the Nova site, I've seen the videos, I've seen the GoPro stuff that people were putting out. It doesn't do it justice at how small of an area it is. I'll be honest, it seemed really big when you see it on camera and things like that. It looks like a very big area, but the reality is it's really small. It kind of felt like fish in a barrel, really. When these Hamas terrorists showed up, the area is so compact and there's like nothing around that these people were sort of in this open area and there's nowhere to go. And many people who did flee Nova unfortunately ended up on the road that I described earlier that was cut off by Hamas, and everyone was killed along the way. Many of us have seen the videos, unfortunately. But really what stood out to me was the way that it's been remembered. Many of you might have seen photos. Again, go on my Instagram to find it. You'll see that there are stakes in the ground with photos of the people who were murdered in the spot, sort of in this mishmash, random order, no rhyme or reason for it. And reminding me of my time in Poland, I remembered in Treblinka, which is a death camp where 800,000 people were murdered, there is today an open field because the Nazis destroyed the actual camp. And now there are just massive stones with the names of cities that were taken there as a memorial. And I felt like when I was walking around the Nova site with this random scattering of photos of victims, that it felt oddly like Treblinka. When I would walk around these stones looking at the names of all the cities, here I am at Nova, and I'm walking around these pictures and looking at names of people who had been killed. And it was eerily similar. There were stories of people being tied to trees in the region. They had signs showing where certain people were found tied to trees and murdered. The level of depravity and just the complete lack of humanity there is something that really can't be described. I can't even imagine seeing what it looked like the day of. And these poor, young, beautiful people, like they were all in their 20s, in the prime of their lives, just at a music festival like Coachella or one of these festivals that many of us would go to. And here is just a memorial to their slaughter, for lack of a better word. I don't know if words will ever be able to describe what it feels like to be there. Really, there's no words. It's oddly similar to the Holocaust sites. Beautiful. It was birds chirping out in the wilderness and the trees, and no wonder why they chose this place for their festival. It was absolutely beautiful, and many Holocaust sites, if you didn't know what happened there, would be very beautiful too. Today, if and when you go there, you'll see these memorials that are being set up. Families are putting up various memories of their family members, trying to write their story so someone who comes to visit can understand. These are not just sort of nameless, faceless people. These are people with lives, and you can hear and read their stories. But eventually, we had to leave, unfortunately, and we went to our next site, which is the city of Sderot. Sderot is an interesting place because you might have heard of it many times if you followed the news. Sderot is one of the biggest cities, not a kibbutz, it's a legitimate city, and it's just at the top corner of the Gaza Strip within Israeli borders. And this city tends to get rocketed a lot. The reason being because in the early 2000s, when Hamas officially took over that region, their rockets were not as capable of going further, and so Sderot was sort of the closest spot to shoot at. So you've been hearing for years, Sderot's been hit by thousands and thousands of rockets from Hamas. And I always kind of pictured it as like a not such a big place, like a kind of a crummy place to live. And when we pulled in, it looks like a beautiful multi-story buildings, little homes. It's a beautiful place to live. Like anybody wanting to live in North America would be proud to live in a city like this. It just unfortunately is literally right next to Gaza. We went up to this overlook in Sderot and we looked out really maybe a mile or a kilometer or two across the road, and you can see Gaza. You can see all of the main cities that we've talked about endlessly on this program, Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and it's literally not that far away. We were met by a member of the community, and he explained to us what's been going on for the last number of years, the thousands of rockets they're dealing with, and the PTSD that their students have, and it's really kind of tragic. This is a normal, average city. It's got about 30,000 or more residents. It's absolutely normal. And yet, unfortunately, it's hit with rockets constantly. But he explained to us what happened on the day of October 7th. This is yet another spot that Hamas decided to attack. Many of you may have seen on television or online this video of a pickup truck in sort of a roundabout of a city with a big gun on it, and they were trying to essentially shoot at homes. This was in Sderot. The terrorists had infiltrated, they had gotten through the fence. As we know, they got through in multiple points, and they literally went across the road right into Sderot, and they were essentially wreaking havoc in Sderot. Like every story you hear, unfortunately, it seems like when the rockets went off, everybody went to their shelters, And everyone said the same thing. After about 20 minutes of these rockets going off and it not stopping, something is going wrong here. And unfortunately, they didn't realize until it was a little too late that the Hamas members had broken through and actually come into their town. This was extremely well planned because Hamas went in and the first thing they did was they took over the police station of Sderot, knowing that would be a lifeline for anybody within that whole city. And they would cut off any kind of communication and any kind of support that they'd have to stop the terrorists. One of the saddest stories that we were told while we were there was one that you probably know of. You've probably seen the videos. Some of you might remember the video that was released on the day of from a police body camera where there was a young girl in a car. And I'm going to play that for you and I'll try and tell you what they're saying if you don't speak Hebrew. It's a little hard to hear because of all the shooting. I'll tell you what they're saying, and then I'll tell you the story behind this little video clip that maybe went viral in a way. So what the girl is saying, she's in the back of a car, and she was saying to these police officers while they were coming up to the car, "Are you police? Are you from Israel?" And that broke my heart when I first saw it originally. But then knowing now the story behind it, she's in a police station parking lot, and there are men who are from Hamas everywhere, shooting and killing people and whatever. So when she sees men with guns coming up, this little 3-year-old girl, the first thing she asks is, "Are you from Israel?" And they said, "Yes, sweetheart, we're from Israel. We're going to take you out of here." And still to this day, it gives me like goosebumps. And it makes me so emotional to see a 3-year-old girl having to know the difference between good guys and bad guys with guns, which should never have to happen. She also tells the police officers that there's a baby in the car. And I want to tell you about these 2 children and their story. So these 2 young girls who were from Sderot were going out with their mother and father. And when they were driving on the road out of Sderot, the alarms went off. The sirens called Seva Adom. It means red alert. And so typically, if there's no shelter around, the rule is in Israel that you get out of your car, you find a little place that you can hide, and you put your hands over your head and you pray that the rocket doesn't hit you. And so when they did that, they got out. The mother went to the driver's side to the left, and the father went to the other side and ended up going sort of around a little wall. And unfortunately, when he went around the wall, he ran into Hamas terrorists who were in a truck. And they killed him right on the spot in front of the daughter, the 3-year-old, who, as he was dying, he said, essentially, "Go run to your mother." And she went to her mother. And so her mother tries to take the 2 kids and put them into the car and tries to take off. And she was killed in the car, unfortunately, again, in front of the daughters. There's a 3-year-old and a younger baby. And what ended up happening was they didn't notice, these Hamas terrorists didn't notice the babies in the back. Thank God. So they were in the car, and eventually the police officers and the people who came to rescue the people in the area went into the car and saw the unfortunate mother is dead and the 2 kids in the back. And so he happens to flag down a random driver who was driving by, and he says to the driver, "Hey, please, please, please stop. Can you take these kids and just drive them anywhere, get them out of here, somewhere safe?" And the man driving by happened to be a Bedouin Israeli, a Muslim Arab Bedouin Israeli who was driving by and said, absolutely. He gets into the driver's seat of the car and he drives. And his first thought is, I'm going to take them to the police station. And so he goes to the police station. It's the safest place in the city, obviously. And on the way to the police station, he runs into the Hamas terrorists who were, as I said, taking over the police station and destroying the police station. And they shot him immediately in the car. This is an innocent man, an Arab, a Muslim, a Bedouin, but they don't really care. They wanted to kill every Israeli, no matter what background you were. And this poor man died trying to save these 2 kids. And that's when we get to the spot where the police officers finally come up to the car in the middle of this gun battle and take these 2 kids and take them away. And thankfully they did survive, but unfortunately both of their parents were murdered. This story really hit home for me because I had seen this video and watched it in tears every single time. And to finally find the whole story around that and to find out what had happened to the parents and the before and after was just too much to bear when I was there. All of these stories that we were hearing were just tragic in every possible sense, and the lack of human decency. Speaking to the person who is the head of the community there, many of us asked him sort of what the plan is. How do you keep living here? And he says he loves this community and he's not going anywhere. But unfortunately, they need to pick up and move on. And he says, even as all of the rockets were coming down from Gaza over the years, he always had hope that maybe something would change. There'd be some sort of peace. He admits that he's kind of losing hope after October 7th, seeing the complete and utter dehumanization of the Jewish people. In order to do some of these things to people that he saw, he has less hope, but he thinks that it is possible. But the people of Gaza need an Arab voice, someone from outside their region, maybe the UAE or the Saudis, to come in and essentially clean up their whole area and get rid of the hate that causes this kind of death. On an interesting side note, this was the day that I was attacked by Hamas, because while we were in Sderot, we were heading to a school because we wanted to talk to some students who were coming in to speak with us about their experiences. And right when we were getting off the bus, apparently some people towards the back of the bus said that they saw the actual rockets flying out of Gaza into the air. But we heard the Seva Adom, the sirens, the alarms, and we had to go into the school and make sure we were safe. Thankfully, the schools there are all rocket proof for obvious reasons. So we were fine. But I had my first taste of what it felt like to be shot at by Hamas terrorists. But this wouldn't be the last time I avoided terrorism on this trip. These are literally just a handful of stories from that day. And pretty much everybody in Israel is affected by all of this stuff, either directly through their own families or friends who were at Nova or lived in a kibbutz. I'm going to end this episode here because it's already kind of long as it is, and I don't want to make it too long. The next episode, I think I'm going to try and talk about the next part of our trip, which is speaking to the hostage families, the victims' families, and some of their stories from that day, which are honestly just heartbreaking. In the end, speaking just about these days specifically, it was eye-opening to say the least. But it was very much important for me to go and see these sites because the misinformation that's going out is off the charts. And I'm able to say that I was there, I stood in those homes, I spoke to those families, I spoke to the students about what they're going through, the PTSD they're dealing with. One of the students was telling us at the school about the trauma that she experienced, that she gets sick when she hears or sees or smells certain things, reminds her of that day. And one other student who's using an AI chatbot, essentially, to express her feelings to it because she doesn't feel like any person can understand what she's going through. And she fears the judgment and the not being able to really explain that she uses AI to talk to it because it never judges her and it just responds in a way that's non-judgmental and it makes her feel like she's heard. It's heartbreaking to know that these communities have been essentially decimated. On the next episode, I'll try to give a little more information on the next half of our trip, and hopefully you'll stick with me. I know these are very tough topics. I know that these are long episodes. I apologize, but these stories need to be told. And as for that other time that I faced a terrorist attack, many of you probably have heard on television by now about the Houthis striking Tel Aviv with a drone. I happened to be pretty much a couple streets down from there the day before. That apparently I was almost next to a Houthi drone attack. So that was twice. I joked that maybe I should have gone north and been hit by a Hezbollah rocket in that area, and I could have gotten the full bingo card of terrorist attacks that the Israelis are dealing with. Show your support for Israel. These people are really trying to keep it together in a very difficult time. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.